Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we start out in the direction of Vuhledar, where the Russians have managed to advance about 3 kilometers in a straight line. This has allowed them to cross over the river line here west of Vuhledar and gain a proper foothold. The Ukrainians have several lines of defense to the west of it. They are bypassing that by advancing here to the east. Their objective could be to bypass the defenses completely and attack Novokrainka directly. However, there's also a potential that they could go in a eastern direction or simply to flank the fortified positions here north of Prechestivka. Therefore, we can see that the most significant change is that with this foothold, the Russians can now develop their offensive operations in multiple directions and expand their foothold across towards the supply lines around Vuhledar, or simply to attack the Ukrainian positions to strengthen their own and push towards the next town, completely ignoring Vuhledar. This Russian advance was confirmed with this footage of a Russian armored convoy being hit by Ukrainian FPV drones. So we see that the Russians continue their offensive operations here in the Vuhledar direction, and to the north in the direction of Maximilianivka, the Russians have gone through Ostre and pushed towards the penal colony, the prison here in the area, where they are fighting over it. This comes at the same time as the Ukrainians are launching a counterattack towards Vuhledar to try to regain control and cut off the Russian forces in the area. So we see that there is this back and forth here north of Maximilianivka. The Russians need to push to gain control over Maximilianivka, otherwise the Ukrainians will be able to continue counterattack operations here to the south, where their front line is not very wide for the Russians. However, since the Russians do have control over Krasnoyarivka to the north, they can supply from a northern flank and push in the direction of Alexandropil, where the objective could be to expand and secure a supply line, even if they would lose Hostre. But it's more likely that they'll fight over Hostre itself, try to win that fight, and then push towards Maximilianivka from the northern direction, both from Hostre as well as from the penal colony, to attack from two flanks in the northern direction and directly head on from the east. The Ukrainians here are attempting their best with this counterattack, as they need to secure this road between Alexandropil and Kurakhove, otherwise they will not have any exit for the soldiers within the pocket northwest of Krasnoyarivka. Especially since the Russians have also started offensive operations direction of Hirnik, where the Russians have not just gained a foothold in the northwestern parts, they've also captured the school in the northeastern parts. With this, they have secured a foothold on two different flanks of the northern section of Hirnik as they continue the battle over the town. In the western direction of Ukrainsk, the Russians have expanded further, attacking one of the mines here to the south of Selidove, which has cut off the connection between the main road between Selidove and Hirnik. At the same time, the Russians, with this, will be able to launch offensive operations towards Sukhorine, where they are flanking the Ukrainian fortified positions. They've gained control over the fortified positions west of Ukrainsk, and they've also attacked northwest of Ukrainsk in the direction of Selidove, where they've managed to gain control over another fortified position of the Ukrainians in the area. Therefore, we see that the current situation is that the Russians took control over Ukrainsk and are now developing their offensive operations in a flower maneuver where they're attacking in 3 separate directions, expanding from Ukrainsk itself. They're likely also fighting for the fortified positions southwest of Ukrainsk to start storming Sukhorine, which is another important town in the area, as it has a rail connection between Selidovo, Pokrovsk in the north, all the way down to Kurakhove in the south. This rail connection the Russians have yet to gain a foothold within. If the Russians can control over the mine here to the south of Selidove, they'll be able to gain a foothold and cut off the connection physically. At the same time, they'll allow them to advance both in a southern and northern direction along the railways. As we can see, the railways are surrounded with the forest lines, similar to the one in the Pokrovsk section of the front line, which they had developed offensive operations through. This means that they can use this as another railway to develop offensive operations. However, unlike the railways from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk, the railway here is not located entirely in the high ground. It remains on an area where it can be elevated next to its surrounding, but not really that much. It is more at a reasonable level, and there's also the river crossing here where they are at the same level as its surroundings. But generally there's no height elevation advantage for the railways. But it is not at a lower elevation either. This means that the forest lines should cover from direct fire, but there should be no height advantage and visual advantage from obtaining control over the railways. Therefore, it is likely that the Russians will look to gain control of it and advance through it, similar to what they have done. It will simply not be as advantageous as it has been with their long advance from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. Further north here in the direction of Mykolaiivka, the Russians following the full control over Vuhledar are now pushing further in the western direction towards Mykolaiivka. The objective here is to regain control over Mykolaiivka. The Russians were unable to hold on to it due to strong Ukrainian counterattacks from the Pokrovsk direction with the reinforcements arriving. This allowed the Ukrainians to stabilize the situation and push the Russians back across the river line, but the Russians have since expanded their control in Vuhledar to gain full control over the town, which strengthened the Russian supply lines in the area and has allowed them to make a new push towards Mykolaiivka. The Russians are slowly pushing along Krusy Yar towards Krasny Yar and up towards Mykolaiivka from the south and through Vuhledar in the eastern direction towards Mykolaiivka. They will also likely push along the railways to the western flank of it and attack Mykolaiivka from 3 directions. At the same time, the Ukrainians have secured their positions along the fortified positions northwest of Novhrodivka, strengthening their defensive positions, which has led to a stagnation in the Russian push towards Lysivka, where they've managed to gain a foothold in the eastern outskirts of it, but nowhere near the fortified positions, which means that their foothold is not a strong one, and they are unable to develop their offensive operations further. Instead, it is likely that they'll focus on Mykolaiivka on the eastern flank, and then push towards Sukhny Yar from the rear. In the Toretsk section of the front line, we see that the Russians have expanded their control in the residential area further, where they are expanding following the control over the remaining parts of the apartment complex area through the residential area, where the Ukrainians are unable to show much resistance. This will likely continue until the Russians have aligned the front line in the residential area with the next apartment complex area and industrial zone in the central parts of the city, where the Ukrainians will set up their main defensive positions and resistance. Further north in the direction of Makiivka, the Russians have continued their offensive operations, capturing the southeastern parts of the town and northwestern parts of it. The Ukrainians still have a foothold in the northwestern outskirts of Makiivka, and they still control the southwestern parts, which is separate from the main parts of the town. But other than that, the Russians have gained control over the vast majority of it on the eastern and western bank of the river line. This means that the Russians will expand their zone of control along the Serbets river line here along Makiivka, and they'll continue pushing down south towards Nevske, where they recently made a push from the eastern direction towards Nevske. There will likely be a combined assault from the northern and eastern parts, cutting off the Ukrainian presence in the northeast of Nevske, which would lead to the start of the battle over the town. So we see that the Russians continue offensive operations here in the Serbets river line direction. There's no speedy changes or rapid developments, but they are slowly moving through and inching forward to gain control over further positions along the river line. In the Kursk section of the front line, we have several changes here as well. In the direction of Veseloe, we see with the geolocated footage that the Ukrainians have managed to reach the northeastern parts of Veseloe. However, according to the reports, it is simply bypassing the town rather than gaining control of it. Based on this, we see that Ukrainian armored vehicles are moving up towards the northeastern parts of Veseloe, dropping up infantry. Therefore, we can see that the objective of the Ukrainians is to hit the supply line between Veseloe and Glushkovo, where the objective is to set up some ambushes and control the road between the two towns, which will limit the supplies going to and from Veseloe and strengthen their offensive operations towards the town itself. The objective could also simply be to create a buffer between them and a push towards Glushkovo, where their objective would be to bypass Russia's defensives and hit their supply lines. Even if they don't control it, they just need to fight over it to limit the supplies going to the Russian forces counterattacking in the east. That same counterattack has managed to recapture the villages of Terino and Nikolaevo Terino and lead to the Russians reaching the outskirts of Svetlikovo, where they here are cutting off the road between Svetlikovo, Sucha, all the way to Lyubimovka. This means that the main road now is unusable for the Ukrainians, as the Russians have gained positions near it and are within fire control of the road. This means that the Ukrainians will be unable to use the road without getting under fire by Russian forces. This means that they'll have to go a roundabout way to resupply their forces in the rest of Lyubimovka, which points towards the Ukrainian positions within the towns, weakening and the Russians being able to push through to gain control over them, which would cut off the Ukrainian positions in the direction of Volgovka further northwest. So we see that the Russians are here looking to cut off the supply lines between Sucha and Volgovka, and this would surround several forces of the Ukrainians in the area and limit their ability to hold back the Russian forces. The main forces fighting here in this direction is the 56th Air Assault Regiment of the Russian Armed Forces, as well as the 22nd Mechanized Brigade and 82nd Air Assault Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. In the southern parts of the Ukrainian Kursk offensive, we see that the Russians are counterattacking further beyond Borki and are now pushing towards Plekhovo, which is surrounded with a river to the west and to the north of it, the border area to the south, and the Russian positions to the east. The border area is difficult for Ukraine to cross over as there's no main roads or anything similar, and the terrain is generally not really good. This is why the Ukrainians push not across the border area, but from the western parts through the river line, as that was an easier connection than the direct border crossing. This means that generally the Russians need to push towards the river line to cut off the Ukrainian supply lines in the area and push the Ukrainians out of Plekhovo, which will allow them a strong flank in the south to then focus their forces in the direction of Sucha, where a battle towards that town could begin. This would force the Ukrainians either to withdraw towards Sucha and create better favorable defensive positions, rather than continuing the offensive operations in the north and northwest as well as northeast, where they are continuing the offensive operations despite the Russian counterattack hitting the Ukrainian positions in Svetlikovo, which could threaten directly their supply lines towards Sucha, and that would completely cut off all of the supplies to the entirety of the Kursk offensive. The Russian forces are now less than 10 kilometers from cutting off the main supply line of the Ukrainians in the Kursk direction, and cutting off how many? Simply counting the brigades, we have 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14,000 Ukrainian soldiers within the Kursk region. That is, if all of these brigades are fully staffed and all of them are fully located within Kursk. However, this is a very significant amount of soldiers here within the Kursk region, and if all of these are cut off by the Russians cutting off the road here by Sucha, then Ukraine would be in a very critical situation with this section of the front line, and it could lead to the Russians simply starting their own offensive in the collapse of the Ukrainian forces in the area. And that is all for this update. We see that the Ukrainians are in a very critical situation in the Kursk direction, and the Russians simply continue advancing in the eastern section of the front line, where a total of 12 Russian advances compared to just 2 Ukrainian advances across the entire section of the front line. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, and check out my Patreon for additional content. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.